welcome to week 6. This week, we're going to talk about the social construction of reality. This idea that we are constantly shaping our reality through social interactions. The idea that there is no inherent reality and no inherent meaning in anything, rather that we're constantly negotiating our meanings through interactions with one another. And as we do this, we're constantly creating and shaping reality through our interactions. So I want to talk about some theorists who discuss this concept of the social construction of reality and how through interactions we're negotiating meaning and constructing or creating the reality that we experience. So I want to start with W.I. Thomas. So W.I. Thomas came up with what has been called the Thomas theorem. And the Thomas theorem says if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. And essentially what this just means is that, when we're experiencing the world, we look at a situation and in our minds, we come up with an idea about what is happening. And based upon our idea of what is happening, we then respond to that situation. So let me give you an example here, right? You're walking through the store and you come upon this situation. A woman just slaps a man across the face. In that instance, you create in your mind an idea or an understanding of what's happening. And there are so many different possibilities of what's happening in this moment. Does she slap the man because he did something offensive to her and this is her reaction? Does she slap him across the face because they're acting out a scene and there's a movie camera on them? Does she slap him across the face because that pesky mosquito that's been nagging them their entire shopping time lands on his cheek and this is her chance to get it? Depending on how you frame that reality you're experiencing, you're going to respond to it accordingly. If this is an assault, are you going to call the authorities so that they can deal with the perpetrator accordingly? If it's a movie that they're shooting, are you going to stop and watch and perhaps get your own video camera out to record the experience? If she finally catches that bug that was potentially passing West Nile or Zika from one person to the next, are you going to commend her on getting that bug? The idea again here is that nothing is absolute. There are lots of different potential realities, and depending on how we define a situation, we're going to respond to it as if it has that particular reality. So the next theory is Garfinkel's ethnomethodology. And again, this is another theory on the social construction of reality. And Garfinkel was really interested in the study of the way people make sense of their everyday surroundings. Garfinkel thought that we had these taken for granted assumptions about the way that the social world works, that we're constantly making sense out of nonsense, that there is no actual reality, rather that we're creating one in our minds. We're giving meaning to something that actually is pretty devoid of meaning. And so what Garfinkel did to understand this or to demonstrate this was he engaged in what are called breaching experiments. And a breaching experiment is essentially just this process of disrupting people's taken for granted assumptions about the way that the social world works, right? Pointing out to them that there actually is no meaning in something that they're giving meaning to. So, for example, 7th graders do this all the time when someone says to them, "Hey, what's up?" And they look up and say, "The ceiling," or "the sky." They're reinforcing the idea that when someone asks them what's up, they don't really mean what is up, what is above you, but rather what's going on. And they don't actually even mean that, because the only response that we look for when someone says, "Hey, what's up?" is nothing much. How about you? Now, what meaning is really in that? Or, for example, when someone says, "Hey, how are you?" and you just unload about how you're doing that day. If you pay close attention, the person is probably going to grimace in such a way to demonstrate like That's not what I was looking for. I really want to know that you're fine and we can move along with our business. And if you're not sure of this, engage in your own little breaching experiment. The next time you go to a public place, say a grocery store or a bank, and someone says, "Hey, how are you?" Tell them how you're really doing and see how they respond. A couple other ones, Garfinkel was pretty famous for using his students to engage in social experiments for him. So he told them, the next time you go on an elevator, instead of walking into the elevator and then turning around facing the doors and silently stand there as the elevator either ascends or descends, face the people in the elevator. See how they respond. Their responses are probably going to be some visual indication that they're uncomfortable by your interactions, reinforcing this idea that, we have these taken for granted assumptions about the way that you're supposed to behave in an elevator. He also had students go home and act like strangers in their own home. Again, disrupting these taken for granted assumptions about how you're supposed to behave or interact in the comfort of one's own home. The next and last sociologist I want to talk about in terms of studying the social construction of reality is Erving Goffman. Now, Goffman engaged in what's called dramaturgical analysis, essentially because he equated social society to drama or theater, right? This idea that the whole world is a stage. Famous Shakespeare quote. And what Goffman said is, just like actors on a stage are concerned with putting on a presentation of themselves, so are everyday people. He thought that everyday people engage in what he identified as impression management. They're going throughout their lives, interacting with others, trying to manage the impression that other people have of them, right? So just like the actor on the stage is playing a particular character, he says people in their everyday lives have these social positions. And just as characters in a play would have the scripts that they follow, the social positions that people hold come with certain roles, right? Things that we talked about back in chapter 4, the difference between statuses and roles, those social positions and the expected behaviors that come with them. And so Goffman kind of created this idea of presentation of self or impression management one day when he was sitting in a restaurant, right? And for those of you that have worked in a restaurant before, you know the difference between front of the house and back of the house. Or those of you that have been in theater before, you know the difference between, front stage and backstage. So Goffman says, when we're on our front stage, we're concerned about creating an impression in the minds of others. And he was in a restaurant and he was observing servers, and he was observing how servers were interacting with the people in the restaurant, the customers, and they were smiling and they were chatty and they were talking politely and they were very poised. But then he saw that something switched, that all of a sudden they would go on their backstage, right? Or to the back of the house where the kitchen is. And all of a sudden their language changed, the demeanor changes, the interactions change entirely. He thought, observing this person as they go from the front of the house to the back house, from the dining room to the kitchen, their entire persona changed. The way that they spoke, the language that they used, the demeanor that they had, that it was almost a Jekyll and Hyde type of experience. And Goffman started thinking about, people in our everyday lives and how we kind of do that. At some points we're on our front stage, we're concerned about creating the impression in the minds of others, and then others were on our backstage. It's where we're preparing for our front stage performances, where our guards are let down a little bit. We're not so concerned about creating the impression in the minds of others. So this experience of being in a restaurant and watching the differences of servers in the front of the house, in the dining room, to the back house, to the kitchen, influenced his theorizing, equating human interaction in the social construction of reality to drama, to theater, to stage. So Goffman says, as we are concerned about creating an impression in the minds of others or practicing what he calls impression management, we put on performances. And the way that we do this is we use costumes. We use our clothing to create an impression in the minds of others. So you're going on an interview, you're probably going to dress quote unquote professionally to create a professional impression in the minds of the people that are interviewing. You use props, right? So when I'm teaching, I wear professional attire. I use props. I use things like computers and projectors. I use my notes. I use pens and papers and textbooks, and all of these help to create an impression in the minds of students that I am an adequate instructor. Right now, I am what Goffman would tell you on my front stage. I'm trying to create an impression in the minds of you all that I am a competent instructor, knowledgeable in the field of sociology. And my prop right now here is this computer presentation that I've created for you. Demeanor, right? We hold ourselves in certain ways when we're trying to create an impression in the minds of others. So again, on an interview, we might be very poised, sit up straight, look people directly in the eye, use a voice that is strong and confident, and this all helps to create impression in the minds of people that we're interviewing. Again, the set can also be used to create an impression in the minds of others. And Goffman noted too that the set is designed to bring about certain reactions in others. So you can see here from this comical little cartoon, the doctor saying to the patient, I didn't ask you to undress so I could examine you. I asked you to undress because it's essential to the doctor-patient relationship that I be fully clothed and you be sitting there in your underwear. So the idea here is that the doctor is creating this impression in the minds of the patient that they are in control, that they are knowledgeable, that they are the one to be sought out for advice, that they have more power in this situation by being fully clothed, wearing a lab coat nonetheless, and then the vulnerable patient sitting there. We can also think about the classroom again. If we think about the physical classroom, oftentimes it's the instructor who's up front, who's standing, and whose attention the rest of the class is directed towards. All other students are sitting down, often in rows, all facing the instructor. So the design of the classroom is actually set up so that the instructor has the most power, has the most influence by how they are positioned within the classroom. And that helps create the impression in the minds of the students that the instructor is the one that is in charge. Now, Goffman was particularly interested in this concept of embarrassment. Goffman thought that embarrassment came from a spoiled performance. And what Goffman observed or theorized, I suppose you could say, is that after a spoiled performance, everyone feels discomfort. Goffman said that everyone observing the performance and the performer themselves is invested in the performance, invested in the person trying to create an impression in the minds of others, their impression management. And so when they have a spoiled performance, not only do they clearly experience discomfort because they failed at creating that impression in the minds of others, but those watching also feel discomfort at the spoiled performance as well. And so what Goffman theorized or observed is that the audience, or those watching the performance, practice what he called tact, or helping the person save face. So I'll give you a quick example of when I observed someone after a spoiled performance. I was an undergraduate and I was in a class, a very small class, and it was a beautiful spring day, one of the first beautiful spring days. And it wasn't uncommon that our professors would take us outside and we would sit outside and have class. And so that's what we had done in this instance. And we were sitting down with the professor and everybody else. And it probably was about a class of 10 to 15 people. And we were sitting in a circle out on the grass. And the professor was kind of holding court, talking to us about the subject matter for the day. And all of a sudden, the professor, who was sitting down, crisscross applesauce, just leaned slightly to his left and let out a very loud fart. And I heard it, and I was close by. I don't know if I was sitting directly next to him, but very close, and observed this whole incident. And no one reacted. No one laughed, no one smirked, no one did anything, including myself. I didn't do anything. But for the rest of the class, all I could think about was, did that really happen, or did I imagine that happening? Why didn't anyone respond? What's going on here? Have no idea what the lecture was about that day or what we were talking about, what I needed to know, but I clearly remember that instance. Now, as soon as class was over and class was dismissed, I talked to the other students in the class, and then everyone had observed that spoiled performance from our professor. But because not only the professor was committed to creating an impression in the minds of us, the students, that he was in control, that he was professional, we as the students were equally committed to the instructor creating that impression in the minds of us. So when that embarrassing moment or that spoiled performance took place, the professor kept going, rolling with it, completely ignoring the situation to maintain his impression management, and us, the students, didn't react or respond, allowing him to continue to maintain that impression of professional and in charge when we had all observed this interaction. The last thing I want to talk about in relationship to Chapter 5 is this concept of co-presence, or interacting in one another's physical presence. What's happening in society today is that modern technology is changing our interactions. Co-presence is less and less required to interact with a myriad of other people. And what's happening because of this is that we now have increasing social influences shaping our sense of self. So if we go back to Chapter 4 a little bit, we talked about how through interaction, our sense of self is impacted, that we get a sense of self from the way that other people respond to us. So modern technology is allowing us to react and interact with lots of different people to create not only a face-to-face reality, but also a virtual reality. And in creating a virtual reality, our sense of self is being impacted. So now not only are the reality that we're creating take place in the physical world, it's also taking place in the virtual world. And not only do we have to be concerned about impression management in the physical world, we also have to be concerned with impression management in the virtual world. And things like social media only contribute to that, giving us many different avenues to maintain an impression virtually, in addition to maintaining an impression physically. So a couple of things that you're going to explore as part of Chapter 5 this week is a discussion about, well, how does that influence our interactions, this virtual impression management, and how does it influence our sense of self from the responses we have to others virtually? Even your experience of this class is impacted. Your education is impacted by engaging with a class virtually rather than physically. And you could think about, how does that impact the way that you receive education, but also the type of education that you receive. And I think, like with anything else, there are takeaways that we have that are positive and takeaways that we have that are negative. Another thing you're going to do this week is you are going to analyze yourself as you engage in impression management. So not just virtually, but physically as well. So I hope you enjoy this last week of analyzing yourself in everyday life through your social interactions.